I bring that up, that cultural background up, because I feel like we're kind of, at least in the West, we're kind of in a similar, but even more dramatic shift in our culture. And so that's where I was born, when I was born. And so my parents didn't raise me as a Christian. And in fact, my dad um, was uh, my dad was I would say almost uh, anti-Christian. He really didn't. He thought that the Christian worldview and the entire story of Christianity um, was at best morally suspect, and at worst actually really bad. And so that was the environment in which I was raised. He was an English major, and but he had a strong interest in science, and he really cultivated that in me. So as I was growing up, I learned quite a bit about science, and that really instilled in me a desire um, to pursue science as my career. Um, when I was 7 years old, um, my parents decided to uh, spend some time uh, working in some tiny islands in the Pacific Ocean. I won't go into the story of what led us to there, but we ended up moving to Micronesia, which is a large collection of islands in the Pacific Ocean. If you know where Guam is, it's centered around Guam. And we actually ended up living there, not the 2 years we planned, but 6 years. And we lived in increasingly small islands in the Pacific. And that was really formative in my life, because I got to experience a culture completely different than the one that I was born in the US. And so I think that, in retrospect, the Lord gave me that great experience, and it was a great experience to give me an appreciation for the diversity of cultures and geography around the world. And I've often leaned on that experience as I've traveled around the world. So growing up, I really focused a lot of my thinking on issues of science and technology, and ended up going to college to pursue a degree in electrical engineering. And I thought that was a great fit for my interest in both science and technology, but in a practical way that I could make a living. So I pursued electrical engineering, and all the while, my worldview was fairly atheistic. I've always been, I think people would say, Ben's a nice guy. So I was never an angry or mean or bitter atheist like some of the ones that you see in popular culture today. I was always pretty nice. Um, but when it came to anything supernatural, anything spiritual, I dismissed it, because I thought that um, those ideas were uh, ancient superstitions, and that thanks to the tools of modern science, we had basically put those to rest. We had great explanations for the big questions of life through the tools of science. And so really, um, I rested in a lot of, yes, because I was a liberal naturalist. Thank you. I rested thinking that 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 was a well thought out worldview. And little did I realize that honestly, um, that foundation was a foundation of sand. And I just didn't think very clearly through the implications of what science actually revealed. And I wouldn't discover that until many years later. So that was my upbringing. I was an atheist. I believe science and technology answered all the big questions of the world. And I think my attitude reflects the attitude of many non-believers who have put their trust in the high priests of today's culture, which remains scientists. So scientists are still kind of revered as the source of wisdom for our culture today. So fast forward a bit. I finished college. I went to work, and a couple years into that, I met this young lady who was to become my wife. And we developed a friendship, and we dated. And I quickly discovered, and she quickly discovered, that she was a believer and a believer in Jesus Christ, and I was not. And so once we encountered that, I was confident that that was no problem because I could quickly, with my science background and technology and all that stuff, I could quickly talk her out of these silly superstitions that she held. And as I look back, that was very arrogant of me. And needless to say, it didn't work that way. Now, it'll be a surprise to many of you, and it may be a reflection of my wife's walk with the Lord at the time, which was a bit shaky. She definitely believed, but not everything that she did reflected that belief. So she married me, and despite the fact that I was not a Christian and she was. So in retrospect, that was probably the wrong thing for both of us to do. But in my life, at least, it reflects how God does work all things for good for those who believe. And so my story, as you can guess, is one of those. So so we got married, and I'll share a bit. She doesn't mind me sharing part of the testimony, which is not the most happy time. But my wife occasionally suffers from clinical depression. So she gets depressed for really no obvious reasons, no circumstantial things. It's more of a chemical imbalance in her brain that leads to depression. And for those of you who have loved ones who suffer from depression, you know how helpless you feel, because it doesn't seem like there's anything you can do to fix the problem and to comfort them. It's really a challenging thing in many ways. Physical hurt and pain is easier to deal with than mental pain, especially in the form of depression. So, and I'm going somewhere with this testimony, and that's why my wife is okay with me sharing this. So, as an engineer, I hope this isn't stereotypical, but us men, we like to fix things. We like to know what the problem is, and okay, tell me what the problem is, and let me fix it. And this depression thing was something that I learned I could not fix, and that was frustrating to me and a source of just real challenge. And so as part of me trying to comfort my wife, I started going to the church that she was attending. And I didn't go there because I believed. In fact, I went there with a pretty bad attitude, as it turned out. And But I wanted to support my wife, and I wanted to do whatever I could to support her and to make her feel better. And so I would go to church with her. And so I did that for about 4 years. And in retrospect, the Lord started working on my heart during that experience. I should say, too, that quickly in our relationship, um, as me, an unbeliever, and as my wife, a believer, but not trained at all in apologetics. And, she really didn't have, she wasn't equipped with the answers to the main challenges that I would bring up about faith. And, but she was wise enough to give me a copy of a book that you might be familiar with called Mere Christianity. And this is by C.S. Lewis, who is one of the great apologists of the last 100 years or so. And so I read that book, mostly again to honor her and to please her. And I have to admit, and I admitted even then, that many of C.S. Lewis's arguments for the existence of God and his arguments against atheism, they kind of go hand in hand, were challenges to me, were challenges to my notion. And the one in particular, and as you encounter atheists, or you attempt to understand the thinking that atheists have, I would say that the key argument that really stumped me from C.S. Lewis was his version of the moral argument. So you're probably familiar with many different arguments for the existence of God, but one of the most powerful ones is this notion that there is something called right and wrong, good and evil. And we talk about it all the time. But when you start to think about it carefully, you realize that the notion of good and bad, that is, the existence of morality, demands a moral lawgiver. And without a moral lawgiver that is outside of ourselves, that is outside of even the human race, that is transcendent, without that moral lawgiver, the things that we call moral right and wrong, moral good and evil, actually don't exist. And we know that's not true because every part of our being recognizes that there is such a thing as right and wrong, good and evil. And so C.S. Lewis, in his book Mere Christianity, does a masterful job of explaining what I just explained to you. And as an atheist, I was troubled by that. And there's a well-known popular apologist named Greg Koukl. You're probably familiar with his ministry, Stand to Reason. And he explains it like this. Part of our job as apologists is to put a stone in the shoes of unbelievers. And that stone, as they walk through life, continues to kind of bug them. It's always there nagging at them. And for me, C.S. Lewis's argument for morality really was a stone in my shoe. And I would try to ignore it whenever the topic of God or anything came up. I would try to ignore that, but I couldn't because it was such a powerful argument. So that's a little bit of background. I basically said, okay, this is a tough question, and I give credit to C.S. Lewis. I'm going to put this problem on the shelf, and I know that there's a resolution to it, and I'll get to it someday. I just don't know what it is now. So that was the context in which I went to church. And so for 4 years, I sat in the back row and was there for my wife. Now, little did I know that some things were transforming in my in my thinking. And one of the main things that I had to admit reluctantly is that the pastor and his assistant pastor were actually very smart men. So I didn't believe what they said, but I had to admit that what they said, at least from their perspective, made a lot of sense. And that really transformed an attitude that I had. And I think it's an attitude that many atheists have, which is that believers are, to put it bluntly, stupid. Okay? That believers just blindly believe something for no good reason at all. And they embrace a lot of superstition and a lot of just ancient, outdated ideas that the modern world has completely dispelled. So being, sitting in church for those 4 years made me realize that, hey, not all Christians are stupid. And when I thought about C.S. Lewis, who is hardly a stupid person, I started changing my attitude to say, well, I don't believe what these guys have to say, but at least I give them credit that they're not stupid. At the base level, their worldview is not right, but at least I see kind of reason behind what they are believing. So so that kind of was forming the soil of my heart. And after 4 years, there was one Sunday morning that, and at this church, the tradition at this church was at the end of each service, every Sunday, whoever was preaching would make an invitation to people to receive the Lord Jesus as their Savior. And I had heard this so many times. And every time my inside voice responded kind of what's the word? I just looked down my nose at people who would raise their hand at that call. I would think to myself, this poor person has been deceived into this false set of beliefs that's called Christianity. And the pastors have done a really good job of basically coercing them and deceiving them into the kingdom. And as I look back at this now, I realize how arrogant that was, and how little thought I put into my worldview compared to what I put into what I believe their worldview was, and how wrong it was. So that was my attitude. And then this one Sunday, and again, I think it had been a time where my wife had been really suffering from depression, and I was a bit dismayed myself because I couldn't fix her, and nothing I seemed to do would help, and I felt terrible for my wife, and I really felt a bit helpless. And I think God put me in that situation so that one Sunday, when the sermon was over, and I can't even remember what the sermon was, but when the call went out for anybody to receive Jesus as their Lord and Savior, I did not hear the audible voice of God speaking into my ears, but I could hear his silent voice through his spirit, just as clearly as if I could have heard him saying, Ben, today is your day. Today is the day you need to decide You need to decide whether you're going to stop rebelling against me, stop pushing against the goads, stop pushing me away, and let me into your heart. And I could not believe it, but I actually raised my hand and and surrendered my life, surrendered my heart to Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And basically, I admitted that um, I couldn't fix my wife, I couldn't fix me, I needed help. Um, and so my cry was, okay, Lord, you win, help. That was basically my confession of faith. And as I look back on it, and this is, over the years, which I'll describe here in a minute, of just becoming more aware of what this meant, what I recognized happened from a theological standpoint was that was the moment which God took out my heart of stone and he gave me a heart of flesh. And it was by his grace doing that that I raised my hand. And so the faith that I received then was a gift from God, and it was that that allowed me to say yes to God. And so that was my entrance into the kingdom of God. And I mentioned this heart transformation because my experience was that my heart believed, but my head still had all these objections and all these arguments that I had carried around for so many years as an atheist. And those were still there. And so I knew in my heart that it was all true, but I didn't know why, and I didn't know how to defend it. And I still carried, I wouldn't say doubts about my faith, but doubts about my understanding of that. So as is so often the case with new believers, God was very gracious to me and opened up a lot of opportunity for me to start a journey um, of transforming my mind, of renewing my mind. So I shared earlier that so many of my objections came from science, and a lot of it came from my understanding of what the book of Genesis taught about the history of Earth and the universe and life and all that stuff. And I felt that I understood that was, completely diametric to the scientific understanding of the origin of the universe, the origin of Earth and the solar system, the origin of life, evolution, all that stuff. And so just a couple days after that heart transformation on that Sunday, I said, well, let me bravely step into a Christian bookstore and see if I can find, a book or two to maybe start learning more about what had happened. And there at the bottom shelf, kind of in a little corner, was this little book. I picked it up and it was called The Fingerprint of God. And that edition had a picture kind of a galaxy or something on it. And I said, oh, this looks interesting. And so I picked it up and looked on the back, and it said the author was Dr. Hugh Ross, and he was an astrophysicist, and he had worked at Caltech, and but he was a Christian. And so I started looking through the table of contents, and lo and behold, it was addressing a whole bunch of questions that I had from science about the universe and cosmology and the earth and life and all this stuff. And every chapter was about a key issue that had been like a huge barrier for me in thinking that the Christian worldview was something to be considered rationally. So I bought the book, and as it turned out, I had about a 2-week business trip to Asia. So I had a lot of long international flights. I had a lot of jet lag. And so I just devoured this book, and I could not believe what I was reading. It was the first exposure I had had to a respectable scientist who really knew his stuff, who was a solid Christian, and he was explaining what science revealed from a Christian worldview. And what was so amazing to me is that all of the arguments that I had brought forth against Christianity, thinking that this is what science says and this is why Christianity is not true, all of those arguments basically were flipped over. And talk about renewing your mind. This was like a 180 experience for me, because all of those arguments, and I could just count them down, about the origin of the universe, about the design of planet Earth, about the origin of life, about the species that originated. All of those arguments really ended up pointing not away from God, but towards God, and not just towards any God, towards the God of the Bible, and especially as reflected in those first couple chapters of the book of Genesis, where I had found so many of my previous objections as an atheist. So that book really made an impact on me, and what it opened up for me, and I'm so grateful for, is a lifelong journey, loving the Lord with our mind, right? We're called to what? To love the Lord with all of our heart, soul, strength, and what? Our minds. And I had never in a million years thought that that was part of what being a Christian meant, is loving the Lord with our minds. And so that was really exciting to me, and it remains exciting to me ever since. And so I've pursued loving the Lord with my mind to the best of my ability. I'm not always successful, but that's my goal. And through my first exposure with Hugh Ross's book, I discovered this whole world of what's called apologetics. That is, giving good answers for the questions that we ask and the questions that other people ask about why we believe in this eternal hope that God has saved us into. And so I was excited about apologetics. It was all new to me, and it was all fresh. And so I went back to school. I went to my church had a little, where I was saved, had a little Bible college, and I was able to attend classes there and learn basic theology. I learned so much about the Bible that I had never known. A little confession here. And again, make note of some of these things that I'm saying as representative of where I think a lot of atheists are. So I kind of knew when I was an atheist, here's how little I knew about Christianity. I kind of knew about the Christmas story because it's so popular, right? You can't avoid the Christmas story and little baby Jesus, and oh yeah, he was born of a virgin. Well, that's a miracle, and that doesn't happen. But okay, so there's this little baby, and so he's like, I don't know, a great guy. So Christians like Jesus because he's a great guy, and I guess, yeah, he said some good things, and so Christians follow him. Okay, so I knew a bit about Christmas, but then it came Easter, and I really had no idea what Easter was about. And culturally, it's about honestly Easter bunnies and Easter eggs. That's what I knew about Easter, and I had no idea about the death of Christ on the cross, and even less about his resurrection, and even less about what that means and why it is a celebrated thing. The little that I did know, it sounded like really terrible, barbaric, and what's all this stuff about blood on the cross? And I just thought, like, I think, you know, I think my dad was a lot more thoughtful about this and he knew a lot more about it, but I didn't. And so the whole notion of Easter escaped me. I didn't know what it was, and whatever it was, I knew it was wrong and kind of ghastly. And I think many atheists are really ignorant about the basics of Christianity. So keep that in mind when you encounter atheists and you want to have a conversation. One of the first things to do is just start asking questions about their understanding of Christianity. Do you tell me what you understand Christianity to be? And you'll discover quickly that oftentimes they have no idea about the basics of Christianity. And so when they argue against it, they're arguing against something that they don't understand or they understand completely wrong. And so during those conversations, hopefully by asking them questions about what they believe, you can ask questions that then lead them to a better understanding of what we really believe. And once you get that, now you can start having a meaningful dialogue. Okay, so I started going to Bible school, discovered this wonderful life of the mind that is available for us Christians. I discovered apologetics. I got very interested in science apologetics. And thanks to the ministry Reasons to Believe, who is one of the leading science apologetics ministries, I got very involved in that. I eventually had the opportunity, it was a great blessing, to go back to school and pursue a master's degree in apologetics. I had gotten so excited about this and I wanted to learn so much. And I was also given so many opportunities to like speak and teach on apologetics, but I was not qualified for them. So people were asking me to, my Bible college was asking me to teach classes on apologetics, but I didn't have any academic background. Everything I had learned was just, by myself. And, I was volunteering for Reasons to Believe in the Pacific Northwest and sharing a lot of what I had learned and leading that ministry there, but I was very underqualified. So that really led me to pursue my master's degree from the leading university here in the West called Biola. And Biola was where all of my teachers were like apologetics rock stars. And so I spent about 3.5 years going back to school, and they were wonderful times. It was so much work. I had to read so much and do so much homework and write so many papers. But nonetheless, it was really a fun time. So I got my master's degree, and then in 2017, while I was working with a local ministry called Eternal Impact, and I had met Eternal Impact through a church that had launched out of Eternal Impact, I was able to travel to Western Uganda with Eternal Impact on a mission trip. And I had no idea about doing apologetics in a place like Western Uganda. That was the furthest thing from my mind. And in retrospect, I'm really embarrassed that that was my attitude, but it's the truth. So I went with Eternal Impact to Western Uganda, primarily to a little town called Ishaka, Uganda, Rukungiri as well. And as you know, oftentimes guests are invited to speak during the Sunday service. So I was invited to share a little bit of my testimony at Ishaka Community Church. And so I learned later that one of the unique things about Ishaka Community Church is that there is a large medical university in Ishaka. which is surprising because it's a little town. But there's so many medical students of one form or another who go to Ishaka Community Church. And so these are very well educated young people, very smart, got a lot of science background that they need for their medical profession, their medical schooling. So I got up and I shared a bit of my testimony, kind of like I'm doing now, much shorter, but I did share a little bit about the impact of apologetics and my love of science and how it points to the God of the Bible rather than arguing against the God of the Bible. So that little bit was part of my testimony. I probably spoke for about 5 or 10 minutes. And when I was done, a young lady came up to me after the service and she said, "Hey, Ben, I really enjoyed your testimony. Thank you very much. And the part you talked about apologetics really stirred me. And I'm really interested in apologetics. And in fact, I'm finishing up my PhD in molecular biology right now. And someday when I'm done with that, I would love to be able to go back to school like you described and get my master's degree in Christian apologetics." And I was really surprised that anybody would even know about apologetics, let alone be interested in pursuing it, let alone be pursuing a PhD in such a advanced subject as molecular biology. And so we started a conversation there, which quickly grew to about a 2-hour meeting, just impromptu, with about 20 young medical students. And we talked about the intersection of science and faith. We talked about, I just shared a lot about how my pursuit of science used to drive me away from faith, but now really drove me towards faith and gave me a firm foundation. And so that was my first taste of basically taking apologetics on mission. So that was 2017. When I returned from that, I was really stirred by the notion of, hey, is this something that maybe I could come back and do a lot more focus on apologetics, maybe share, maybe do some presentations. And I started asking, well, what about what's happening in Africa on apologetics? So I started looking, researching, and discovered that actually there were a couple ministries doing apologetics. And one in particular was and is a very strong ministry, great friends. It's called the Africa Center for Apologetics Research. And I know Joseph and Veracity Fountain know them very well. And that team is primarily focused on counter cult apologetics. In other words, showing the error in cults. So I teamed up with them and I came back in 2018, so a year later, and we planned a series of seminars that actually started in Rwanda, went to Western Uganda, and then went to Kampala. And there were about 4 different like 3-day conferences where we did multiple presentations on apologetics. And I was just blown away by the response. It was really great. And so I came back from that trip just very encouraged and started thinking more and more about this as a great opportunity to go on missions and really focus on coming alongside my brothers and sisters and talking about the good reasons we have to believe in this good news. So I returned in 2019. So 2017, 18, and 19. In part of that, since I was teaching a course in apologetics here in Oregon, I asked the dean of my college to say, hey, could we use this new technology called Skype, which is a little bit, it was the forerunner of Zoom. Could we use that to include some students from Western Uganda into my class? And they said, yeah, sure, that sounds great. It was the beginning of like remote learning, which is now ubiquitous. But so I Skyped in about 10 students from Ishaka, Uganda into my apologetics class in Canby, Oregon. And that began a process that continues today in a different form. So I was thrilled. It was so exciting. I still have great friends from that course, and I'll be returning in early September back to Ishaka, and we're just celebrating the fruits of what's been happening there and across Africa. So then fast forward a little bit more. I decided I met a couple other people here in the States that shared a vision and a passion for going to places where apologetics was a bit new, and sharing what we could and helping our brothers and sisters to raise awareness of apologetics, raise awareness of resources and training and whatnot, trying to grow apologetics in regions where there was little happening. And so in 2020, late 2021, I came back to Africa and really to do some soul searching and some just meeting and fellowshipping and asking a lot of questions of my brothers and sisters in Africa about this idea. And then in 2022, I officially launched what has become Apologetics on Mission. And so that, for its birth, was a ministry that was still part of Eternal Impact, the ministry that has been kind of the mother ministry and really raised us up. And then at the beginning of this current year, 2024, we left the Eternal Impact nest, and now we're our own 501c3 ministry. And it's Apologetics on Mission. And as the name suggests, our vision is to help raise Christian defenders globally. That's our big vision. We want to see apologetics thriving all over the world in the church, and being a part of evangelism by giving believers great answers, building their foundation, equipping them so that they can confidently preach the good news and be prepared for the challenges that others are going to present to them. And so that's what we're all about. The way we do it is we travel, and we use those occasions to be with our brothers and sisters to develop relationships. We host conferences where we can raise awareness of apologetics, give people a taste of what it's all about, work with partners on the ground that are already doing stuff and see where we can help. And then when we return, we offer certificate courses to give people whose calling is in this area, to give them a first step kind of foundation into apologetics. So we've been teaching our course, and this has become kind of a core part of our ministry. Our course is a 16-class introductory course. We give a certificate for it, and we call it the Introduction to International Apologetics. And the purpose of that is really to give students who complete the course a great foundation to start a journey in becoming a defender of the Christian worldview, becoming an apologist. And we've taught this now, I think, 5 times. We've had 5 cohorts of students. We've graduated about 120 students. And I think some of the students might be on this call right now. And so our goal is for that course to be a first step and to really help them to discover the world of apologetics, which is so important for the church. We need people who are equipped with good answers to give to especially these young people who are struggling in the face of the challenges that that the world is confronting them with. So that's what we do. We have grown quite a bit. We started in Africa, but we've expanded to Brazil. We have a team that works in the Balkans. We're so small that we have to say no to so many opportunities. But as we grow, we hope we're able to say yes more and more. And again, our heart is to see local communities of apologetics leaders thriving. And our philosophy is that while we may be a great catalyst to get things started, it will only be successful long term if we're able to help leaders on the ground there really take it over. And that's why I just love, you know, the fellowship with leaders like Joseph, with ministries like Veracity Fount, with groups like Apologetics Kenya, with ACFAR, and most recently Apologetics Uganda, which is a ministry that we helped launch, and they're just doing great work. And we continue to meet more and more people around the world who are doing great work in this, but we still have a lot of work to do. So let me stop there. I will say that I'll be back in Africa late August through most of September. We'll be traveling to Brazil in October. We are working on a mission to Albania, and you know, Lord willing, we'll be able to open up new regions. And that's why when I see faces like Lukash and Rahil from Pakistan, my heart is stirred to think what might happen in the future there. So it's an exciting time to be involved in this great work. It's a wonderful time. I didn't get to spend a lot of time talking about specific science type of questions and the answers that I discovered. So maybe during our Q&A, if there are specific questions you have, I'd be happy to answer them. So take it away, Joseph.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Ben. That was a good conversation. I've got to learn quite a lot about your story and your journey of faith. And so thank you also for your vulnerability and sharing about your story with your wife. And perhaps that's where the first question will come from. But just to remind those who are tuned in that you are free to send your questions in the chat, and we will be able to pose them to Ben to respond to them. But maybe the first one could be, for some and for many, you would have known many atheists struggle with the question of suffering, right? So you shared the story of your wife's, issue and how that was how you got to church. But for many atheists or agnostics that I have conversations with, the problem of evil or the problem of suffering is sort of like the strongest objection to Christianity. Was that an issue for you, and how did you navigate through that?
Yeah, definitely. And I will share that it's appropriate that this was the first question you would ask, because this is the biggest objection that everybody has to the notion of God. And so it's a very simple concept, which is why it's so powerful. It's the idea that if God is all good, if God is all loving, and God is all powerful, then why the heck, is all this pain and suffering and evil happening? And that's a really good question. And it was one that that of course I could not reconcile. And so looking around and saying, how could a good God, how could a loving God allow all this stuff? So there's no way I can answer that in a short amount of time. But let me give you a couple things to think about. So number one, in the Christian worldview, we have to remember this, is that God actually has already solved that problem. This is the whole Christian hope, is that this is a temporary existence here, right? Our life right here with all the suffering and all the evil is a short duration. And our destiny is to an eternal creation, which is going to be renewed. It's going to be, I like to say, where we are being saved into, the idea of being saved, is into an eternal creation that is everything that we complain this creation is not. Okay, so we complain about this creation. It's full of evil and suffering. Well, guess what? God has in our future, for those who believe, those who are saved into it, that perfect creation that we long for. So God has already solved the problem of evil and suffering. It just awaits us in the future. So we have to answer this question with that context. Secondly, then we can ask the question, yeah, but why doesn't he just put us there in the first place? You know, why do we have to go through this this terrible, relatively terrible existence? And so there's many different answers to that. And one of the answers is what you highlighted and I shared, is that so often God uses suffering and pain to awaken us to the reality that this world is broken. And God, isn't there a better world? Couldn't you have done a better world? And if our ears are open, we'll hear to say, yes, there is. And I invite you into it. Welcome, come, join me in the new heavens and the new earth, in the new creation. And yes, it's you know, it's challenging here and now, but our eternal hope is that perfect creation. So God uses evil and suffering, like he did for me, to awaken me to my need to be saved. And he used the depression that my wife suffered as a means to draw me into his kingdom. And I think if I hadn't had that, I would have been content. Everything was good. Life is great. I have a job. I'm making money. My vision would have been so short-sighted that I would not have felt that longing for eternity, or I would have suppressed it. So there's many other answers to the problem of evil and suffering, but let me leave those two as things to think about.
Yeah, no, thank you. So there is a question from Arnold. Says science is a wonderful and reliable ways to explore the world and the universe. What, in your view, are other reliable ways to understand the world that the skeptic would accept?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like I shared, my testimony was that I really thought that science, in providing answers about the universe, about the earth, about life, had basically made the ideas of spiritual things, the ideas of any particular world religion obsolete, things of the past. These are archaic ideas. We used to lean on those to explain phenomena here on Earth, but now we've advanced beyond that. That was my attitude. What God allowed me to see is that actually the opposite is true. So God reveals himself through his word, right? So he has inspired men to write down what he wants to share with his people through the Bible, okay? But he's also revealed himself in what he has made. And scripture speaks to this. And so if God reveals himself through what is made, and by that I mean, everything, from the things we see from far away through our telescopes, through the life we observe through our microscopes. So everything that God has made, um, he is revealing himself, just like an artist would reveal stuff about him, the artist, through what they create. Science is simply a tool to explore what God has made. And as we use science to explore what God has made, what we discover is that um, just so many things. And let me just list some of them out. That actually the universe has not always existed. Okay, the universe had a beginning, and if the universe had a beginning, it must have had a beginner. And if it had a beginner, that beginner couldn't be part of the universe, right? Because how could it begin the universe before the universe existed? So it has to be something or someone outside of the universe. So just that simple revelation that we gain through science, that the universe had a beginning, points to a beginner. And when you start looking at the qualities of that beginner, it starts looking a lot like the God of the Bible. And then we look at life in the microscope, and we ask ourselves, how did this life come to be? And the more we study, the more we see just amazing design within life. And so we can try to explain that design through a natural process. And the most popular one, which we all know of, is Darwinian evolution. That random mutations and natural selection can explain the design that we see in life. But I would say that a closer look dispels that. We see that the life that we encounter, even the most simple life, is so complicated that it's very difficult to believe that natural forces could have resulted in the complexity that we see in life. Not only that, just trying to understand how life began in the first place. The transition from non-life to life involves such an amazing amount of complexity and design and foreshadowing that natural processes consistently fail to explain that. So a much better explanation is that somebody actually designed life to be what it is. And so again, that points to God's, and specifically the God of the Bible. So in answer to Arnold's question, is that the entire breadth of science, as it reveals God's creation, as we understand it more and more, it consistently fits very well with a Christian worldview, and increasingly does not fit with a purely natural worldview. And so with that, I think we have powerful arguments from science for the existence of God.
Thank you for that. And maybe you could speak a little bit also into the often say called the God of the gaps
Yeah.
fallacy, where do you think sometimes Christians are too quick to appeal to God for things that we cannot explain? At least atheists that I know would say that. So just because it's complex, you will definitely appeal to the existence of God. How would you respond to that sort of challenge? And in what ways is the God explanation not competing with the scientific explanation at all, but rather how are both of them compatible?
Yeah, that's a great question. And part of the reason that I'm passionate about equipping the church with apologetics is because, sadly, we've done a poor job as the church in exactly what you're saying. We are too quick to say, to fill in the gaps in our knowledge with God did it, God did it, God did it. And so we've developed a track record of science coming along and being able to say, oh, actually, we have a natural explanation for this, so God didn't do it. And then we go to the next one. And again, we learn more about science and then dispel the notion of God. And there's a lot of truth to that. We've been too quick to plug God into these holes. And mostly it's from our own ignorance as Christians. So we need to be the best scientists out there. We need to understand, the full range of technology and tools that God has blessed us with to understand his creation. And we need to be really wise in discerning, okay, where is God's hand really active and how is he doing it? And to be able to do it in a way that we can be respected by the broader unbelieving scientific community. So we need to avoid that. Now, having said all that, there's a flip side. So it's not the God of the gaps, it's the naturalism of the gaps. Okay? And so just as we've been guilty plugging in God where maybe he doesn't fit quite right, naturalism is even worse. Plugging in naturalism where it doesn't fit at all. And so so we need to be equipped to be able to call that out. And so I can point out a number of areas. I would say that the origin of the universe, creation from nothing, is one area where naturalism simply says, well, that's a brute fact and it just happened. And if we don't understand it now, we're going to find a naturalistic explanation. So that's one. The origin of life. As people understand more and more the nature of the origin of life, the more challenging that reveals itself to be from a naturalistic standpoint. But they will consistently insist that the explanation is natural, we just don't know what it is. So it's a classic example of plugging in a naturalism of the gaps. Now, I think we need to be flexible and we need to be open to being wrong sometimes, and always be, being faithful to the evidence and being confident that the evidence will lead to the truth. And that truth ultimately is in the person of Jesus Christ. So we can be confident, and we have a good enough track record now, which is why it's so exciting to be a Christian and to be in the sciences today, because God has given us unbelievable tools to be able to see his creation in ways that we've never been able to see it before. Look at the images from the James Webb Space Telescope. They're unbelievable. And we are looking at just such a glorious expression of God's majesty and like super abundance. Talk about our cups overflowing. It's like, you cannot believe how huge the universe is. And yet in all that vastness, really the focus of his creation is us tiny little human beings on this tiny little planet, right? So it's a great time to be able to see God's revelation in his creation with the tools that he's given us today.
Yeah, no, thank you for that response. I remember, so we hosted, I might have mentioned sometime back, we hosted Dr. John Lennox on our Lamppost Conversations. And there is an illustration he usually gives, especially when it comes to competing explanations. And he says that God is not a competing explanation to, the mechanism of the earth and the world, any more than Henry Ford is in competition as an explanation for, the Ford car engine and why it works. And he usually speaks of how if you find water boiling in a kettle and someone asks, why is water boiling? And one way to say it is, the heat burns up or transfers the heat to the kettle molecules, and then they vibrate and they transfer the heat to the water, and then the water begins to boil. And that might be one plausible explanation and correct one, but the other could be that I just want to have a cup of tea. Now, none of those necessarily does compete against each other, but one is a mechanism and the other is agency. But that's one of the things. But I want to take you back to, we mentioned C.S. Lewis and Mere Christianity. We just finished doing our book club, going through Mere Christianity, an amazing book. And the idea of moral argument. And the question that would come from that is, what's the difference between morality and instinct, or even morality and natural selection? In that sense, we do this because we want to survive, or as Richard Dawkins would say, we are dancing to our DNA. What's the difference between instinct and morality?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the books that got me thinking a lot about this question was a book by a guy named Sam Harris. It's called The Moral Landscape. Okay. And this was an important book because Sam is a very thoughtful person. He's a philosopher and a neuroscience, and he's a great communicator. And he made a good attempt to explain morality from a scientific perspective. In fact, I think the subtitle of his book was something like, how science explains our moral values, or something like that. Now, I hope this gets to an answer. It may be a little bit more foundational than what you were looking at, but what Sam was successful doing is explaining how science can help our knowledge, help pursue that which is good, right? We can use science to discover, he called them moral peaks, right? So he envisioned this landscape of peaks of moral betterness, like where things ought to be. And science was a guide to help us to ascend higher and higher on the peaks of morality. And that's a very good claim. I think science is a great tool to help us figure out ways to achieve a moral goal, okay? Where he failed, and completely failed, is to explain where we get that moral pursuit. What defines what is moral? What defines what is a peak and what is a valley? And his naturalistic worldview, from a science perspective, can't speak to that. So science, while it might guide us towards a moral objective, it cannot define what that objective is. It has no voice into that. And so from a purely naturalistic perspective, there is no such thing as objective morality. And yet Sam is an objective moralist, but he has no foundation for that. So essentially, if morality is simply a byproduct of our social upbringing, the way our molecules happen to move in our brains, then it has no firm foundation. And so it becomes simply our own preferences, right? There's nothing outside of ourselves that establishes the right and wrong. It's simply what we prefer. And so when it's up to us, then we can have such things as, the Nazis, who believed it was good to put to death 6 million Jews, right? They thought that was the right thing to do, when we know objectively that is the wrong thing to do. But how do we explain that objective knowledge? It comes from something outside of ourselves. And so, on naturalism, there is no ground for objective morality, and therefore it doesn't really exist. And so pursuing those objective moral peaks that science can lead us to has to start with the foundation of objective morality. What is the peak that we are going after? We have to address that first, and that only comes from a transcendent source, and I believe it only comes from the God of the Bible.
Thank you so much. A question from Patrick he asks, how do you balance between acquiring knowledge or theology which has the potential to puff up and keeping evangelism at the center of apologetics?
Oh, that's a great question. I'll generalize this a little bit, and it's a metaphor I've been using quite a bit, and I think it works. And I think if we apply this general idea to any pursuit that we go after, it works. And that is that oftentimes we think of God as a source of light that shines into our lives, right? And his righteousness shines into our soul and reveals the darkness that is there. And so in our life journey, we can have times when we're walking fairly far away from God, right? So his light is shining on us, but we don't see our sin very brightly because the light seems distant and is not really lighting up much. But then as we draw closer to God, right? As we draw closer to God and we try to conform our lives, we try to walk in obedience to God. And we start paying attention to those areas where his light is shining into our lives and try to eliminate the darkness. If we start feeling a little bit puffed up, a little bit prideful of our success because, hey, look, we're getting better and we're getting closer to God. What happens is that the closer we get to God, the brighter the light shines. And so it starts revealing those nooks and crannies that we never even knew existed, including getting puffed up in our pride about how great we are. So I think there should be a natural balance as we pursue these things. So with that metaphor in mind, that's kind of where I think we strike the balance between seeking to love the Lord with our minds, but also recognizing that our minds are relatively puny, and we ought never to get to the point where we think we have it all figured out and we have all the answers. So we always walk in humility, and we also recognize, and I try to do this all the time, to recognize that really it is the work of the Holy Spirit in a person's heart and soul and mind that actually does the transformation. And we're simply walking alongside those people, and we are a tool in God's hand. So it's not by our own efforts, our own wisdom, our own brilliance that people are saved. It's by the work of the Holy Spirit in their lives, opening their eyes, opening their ears, and without which everything we do is fruitless. So only by his Spirit can we do anything good.
Amen. And maybe related to that, on the other side of atheism, some might suggest or think that atheism is more of it's actually a heart issue than a head issue, and consequently intellectual responses do not necessarily guarantee a transformation, conversion, or conviction as such. And so how do we, especially if we are having conversations with atheists or agnostics or unbelievers, how do we aim for the heart and not just for the head?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think being honest with that very observation with an atheist would be helpful. And I think if somebody had been speaking to me when I was an atheist on that. Number one, I think there's huge value in removing the intellectual barriers, right? And working on those, because those are barriers that I, as an atheist, hid behind, right? I hid behind and I put those up all the time, which were like my first line of defense. I think if we can remove those and have the conversation about what is happening in our soul, because there are certain things in our soul that, while they're not irrational, they're not necessarily, they're kind of non-rational. They're more emotional, and those are really important. And so the way I think we do this as Christians is by manifesting the love of Christ into our atheist friends and overwhelming them with an emotional response and tie that and trying to affect their soul by love in a way that disarms them. And so and I think Jesus was the most radical revolutionary in this. And so much of the moving stories in the gospel are when Jesus reaches out to those who naturally we would say, no, they're bad. We don't want to associate with them. No, Jesus stepped into them. So we need to view our atheist friends not just from the perspective of, we've got to win an intellectual fight with them, but that our objective is to try and remove some of those intellectual battles or barriers so that we can get to the heart and love them and really let the Holy Spirit move in their heart and be anticipating that, sadly, like it was for me, it may take some pain and suffering to bring them to a point in their soul and their heart where they realize that that they need the Lord, they need God, they need saved, they need help.
Well, thank you for that. And maybe touching on that, trying to remove the intellectual objections and barriers. Rahil is asking a question here. First of all, he says, thank you for sharing your testimony with us. And he says, which are your approaches to apologetics? Or which approaches to apologetics do you usually either mostly use or agree with?
Yeah. So I really like to use worldview thinking as the framework to have apologetics conversations. And I like to boil it down to, appeal to let's have a conversation about the big and important questions in life that we don't spend enough time thinking about. And these are questions, these are the basis that form our entire picture of reality. So there are questions about origins. Where did we come from? How did we get here? There are questions about meaning and purpose. Why am I here? Questions about morality. What is right and wrong, and how do we know it? Questions about our identity. Who are we? Who am I? And then finally, questions about destiny. So these are great, and every thinking person should spend time thinking about those big questions about reality. And every one of those questions have profound theological repercussions depending on how we answer them. So I like to begin conversations talking about worldviews and asking questions. How do you answer these important questions? I know that you've thought about these, and I like to give people a lot of respect and say, I know you've thought a lot about these, and I'm really curious as to what you think about where did we come from? What is our purpose? How do we know, is there such thing as right or wrong? Or is it just like whatever's right for you is right for you and whatever's wrong for you? How do we establish those? and really, who are we as human beings and where are we going? And those always generate apologetics related answers. And as we do those, what we want to be, our sort of game plan should be that that those answers start leading towards the biblical answer, which is the truth. And only the biblical worldview answers those questions satisfactorily. We want to leave them unsatisfied with a non-biblical answer, and we want to entice them with a good, solid, satisfying biblical answer.
Thank you so much for that. There is another question here from still from Patrick. How do you approach the question of man's free will and God's sovereignty for us to make the case that God is in control of the universe?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a real easy question. And we've had no theological divide on that. So let me just say that in my journey as a Christian, trying to understand, the tension between man's free will, man's responsibility, and God's sovereignty over that is a very complicated issue. And I've spanned the spectrum from being a staunch Arminian to a Molinist to my current position, I would say was more reformed in nature. So I hold my answer loosely, okay? So if you hear me in a couple years and I've changed, I'm confessing now. So here's what I believe at the moment. And I believe, number one, that God is sovereign over the entire reality. And he knows the beginning from the end. And our choices are incorporated into that knowledge. But I think it extends a little bit beyond that. And I think that people do have free will to be able to choose. But I believe that our nature has been affected by Adam and Eve's fall. Okay, so I believe that Adam and Eve came into this world without an intimate association with good and evil, because they had never committed an act of evil. And but in their temptation, they did fall. They chose the evil, and all of their offspring, including us, have inherited that nature. And what that nature is that we desire self over God. And so our desires, upon which we make our choices, are based on that nature. Okay, so I freely choose, before I was born again, before my nature was changed, I freely choose to rebel against God, because that's what I desire. I think of this analogy. Imagine that there's a cage, and or let's say a field, and you put a pile of lettuce in one corner, and you put some fresh meat in another corner. Okay, and then you let a lion in, and the lion's really hungry. Okay, and you ask yourself, what is the lion going to freely choose? Is he going to freely choose to go eat the lettuce, or is he going to freely choose to go eat the meat? Well, naturally, and I say that intentionally, by his nature is he's a carnivore, and his desire is for the meat. So what is he going to do? He's going to freely choose to go eat the meat. Now you let a bunny rabbit in, the same thing. What is its nature? Its nature is to eat the lettuce. And so its desire is to eat the lettuce. So it freely chooses to go and eat the lettuce. So in the same way, when we're born into this world, our nature is to say no to God and yes to self. And so when we freely choose things, we are freely choosing according to our nature. And it's not like God is forcing us to do that. It's not like somebody's holding our gun to our heads and against our will, we choose the evil. No, we choose the evil because that is our nature. We sin because we're sinners. But thanks to God in his sovereign grace, like my experience was, is he took me, a sinner with a sinner's nature, and by that heart transplant, he regenerated me and now gave me a desire that was different. And my desire was now, I actually did want to submit to him, and I freely chose to submit to him based on my new nature. Now, I will say theologically, sadly, I still live in this body of flesh, right? So my spirit has been reborn and has been regenerated. And so now my spirit chooses to follow after him. But I live in this body of flesh that continues to tempt me to rebel. And so I live this Romans 7 life where I do the things that I don't want to do and I don't do the things that I do want to do. And my goal is to always crucify my flesh every day, say no to flesh, and say yes to spirit. And I freely do that. So that's about as good as I can do. So yes, I believe in free will, but I believe that we choose according to our nature, to our desires. And that's the way I resolve it.
So the conversations tend to get sweeter as the time is running out. That tends to be the way things
By the
are.
way,
We do. Yeah, go
I can
ahead.
stay on. I have another Zoom meeting at 11 my time, which is in 20 minutes. So I just
Yeah.
need like 5 minutes to reorient. And I will say that my conversation is with a wonderful woman who is an amazing scientist. She falls into that category of like amazing Christians and amazing scientists. And so she was recently, actually on Saturday, she spoke for Apologetics on Mission, much like this. So we have a similar thing to Lamppost, which we call AOM Talks. And she spoke there, and it was a great presentation. The reason I'm meeting her is because she's actually on a completely different mission. She's going to Kenya. And so I'm going to be talking to her about apologetics in Africa. And she is a visiting scholar for Reasons to Believe. And so there's a affiliate of Reasons to Believe in Africa, in South Africa, called Reasons to Believe South Africa. And so that is part of the apologetics growth in Africa that I would love to see continue. And so my encouragement to Leslie, who I'll be talking to, is while you're in Kenya, please have coffee with Kevin. Please meet the Apologetics Kenya people. Please know of what's happening in the region that you're going to be visiting from an apologetics, and think about how you might bring your gifts to bear in that part of the world. So
Yeah, and you can tell her that Uganda has better coffee.
I will
But
definitely tell her. Yes. So trust me, my encouragement to her will be to consider what's happening and consider whether it's with AOM or with RTB or with Veracity Fount or whoever. She has a powerful voice to speak into this, and I think we'd all benefit by that.
Amen. So I would love to combine two questions that are sort of like similar, part A and part B. One from Joshua, um, asking about how best do you work hand in hand with local churches for further discipleship?
Mm-hmm.
And the other from Patrick Steele is how can we approach apologetics in the local church context without coming off as being divisive or questioning the authority of the church leadership if some of the questions seem to be touchy or sticky subjects and our leaders
I, I,
train?
I, I love that question. So, first and foremost, um, absolutely everywhere in the church, we need more apologetics. And here in the West, we don't have hardly enough apologetics in the church. I think that the root cause is that for some reason, seminaries stopped teaching pastors about apologetics. If you look at the curriculum for seminaries, there's very little apologetics, and I can't explain why. So pastors go into their ministries not very well equipped. So that's one problem. So they're not very well trained or equipped in apologetics. And the other thing is that, as you say, by nature, apologetics is dealing with challenging issues. And so oftentimes, um, church leaders want to avoid challenging issues. They don't want to cause divisions and in their congregations. And so instead of dealing with them, we simply ignore them. So while that may maintain a veneer of peace within the church community, this is why when we release our young people and we haven't given them good answers and they go off into the world, guess what happens? 70% of them, and I don't care where you look, 70% of them will likely walk away from their faith as soon as they encounter some of the challenges that we didn't talk about in church. Okay, so this is my passion to try to encourage, point out the problem, which is so many young people leaving the church, and offer a great solution, which is let's engage them instead of ignoring the issues and ignoring the doubts and ignoring the challenges. Let's have great conversations. Let's have constructive conversations around these things. Young people will be excited about these kind of conversations. They're always excited about them. And we recognize that the pastors, the leadership, have so many things on their plate that they can't go back to school and learn all this stuff. They need our help. And that's what we're here to do. And under their leadership, we would love to offer to say, hey, let us help our congregation be prepared for an answer for the hope that we have within. This is a command. We can come alongside. We need training ourselves, but we can come alongside and be a support to our church leaders in this area and encourage this kind of dialogue in a constructive way. And if we do it right, it will build a strong foundation for our young people so that when they do go out, not only will they be protected, but they will be confident to share their faith in the face of a disbelieving world. So we've got to do this. And the way we do it is by providing that training, by raising awareness about what we're talking about right now, providing training that goes more in depth, and then helping mentoring and discipling leaders to pursue this within their own church communities. So we love to see our graduates who get really excited about this go to their churches and say, "Hey, I want to lead a 8-week introduction to apologet. I'm going to share some of what I learned with the young people." I mean, that's huge. We love to see that. We love to see it open up, and so that's our hope. That's what we'd love to see.
Thank you. Again, many good questions. We have 3 minutes because I would love to have about at least 10 to maybe 8 minutes for you to be ready.
Thanks.
But one from Arnold asking about resources. What sort of resources would you recommend towards apologetics, but especially if you're having conversations with people who are from communist, maybe worldviews or backgrounds, critical race theory,
Oh yeah.
then the whole sexual revolution and movement and LGBTQ sort of like, ideologies and post-colonial, and you could add the feminist theologies or theories, and then Islam. So there were quite a number of
Yes,
categories that he listed. So
right,
communism, forest theory, LGBTQ, then post-colonialism and feminist maybe theories as well, and Islam.
sure, sure. Well, that's a big span. I would say the good news on that is that thankfully, there are a tremendous amount of resources on every one of those subjects, and you can access them anywhere you have an internet connection. So we are so blessed not only be able to talk like we're talking like here, but after this Zoom, you can go and you can go to so many different ministries. You can go to YouTube and listen to the leading thinkers on all of these and get very well educated by yourself. So that's the good news. The challenge is how do we find these resources? So let me just point to a couple ones
Mhm.
that I like. There's a fairly new ministry called let's see, it's called Apologetics Hub, and it's run by Chris Shannon. And Apologetics Hub, and if you just go and search Apologetics Hub, you'll find he has curated a huge list of ministries and resources on every subject. You can go look at that. A similar ministry is called Apologetics 315. So if you go to Apologetics 315, you'll also find a tremendous library of links to different ministries, to different speakers, and lots of great resources there. Specifically for critical theory, I would say Neil Shevney is a speaker who has really focused on critical theory. I really like Monique Dusen. She's a young lady. She lived in South Africa for a while, and she has a lot to say about critical theory and its impact on current culture. There's a great resource in South Africa called Ratio Christi. And Joseph, you probably know Simon Brace. Simon Brace has devoted the last couple of years of his research into critical theory. And he actually spoke for us. If you go to our YouTube channel, he has a great, just really in-depth summary of how we got to where we are in critical theory. So that's critical theory. I would lump in Marxism as well. So cultural Marxism and critical theory kind of go hand in hand. So I'd refer you to Simon Brace, Neil Shevney, Monique Dusen as great resources there. For Islam, boy, there's a lot of resources there too. I would start with, there's a whole series of debates that an apologist named James White has done with a lot of Islamic scholars. And I find that those debates are very informative because they're formal, and they allow both positions to be articulated very clearly. And then there's good cross-examination where they get to have dialogue. And so that's one of the most effective ways that I've learned about Islam, because I get to hear it from Islamic scholars, but I also get to hear from a Christian scholar who, and those can be really useful. Let's see, I can't remember some of the other topics, but I'll just say, let me just say the last thing. Arnold, you need to get a copy of this book. Okay, Joseph, I would love to see us collaborate somehow in a course that uses this book as a textbook, and we just go through. And the beautiful thing about this book is that it deals with so many very relevant apologetics topics, and about in each chapter, about half of the chapter is kind of the general idea, the general issue, but then the other half is taking it to an African perspective, which is really useful for somebody like me to get a broader view of the nuances of the issues from a cultural respect of Africa. So get a copy of this.
Yeah, no, thank you for the advert as well. Absolutely. Please feel free to order that book, and if you need any more details on how to do so, you can always reach out to us. But we have to stop our conversation there. It's been a great conversation, Ben. I've learned quite a lot from you, and I want to believe that those who tuned in have learned quite a lot. Now, I know most of us were not able to tune in. The majority of us who registered were not able to get in because of network issues with what's happening in Kenya. But this conversation is recorded, as you might have noted, and it will be available on our YouTube channels. And so feel free to revisit the conversation. Feel free to refer your friends there, to share as widely as possible. And while you are at it, please hit the subscription notification and the bell itself, because there are many good things. Apologetics on mission, veracity found as such. The idea is to see how we can equip God's people to be on mission for him wherever they are. Ben, I don't want to hold you any longer. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your insights. And for all of you who were able to tune in, thank you so much. Be blessed and have a good night. Ben, have a great day. And may the conversation you have with Leslie be very fruitful.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. All right.